Good afternoon to our audience and to our panelists. My name is Alana Rodriguez, and I am the program manager for the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the International Institute. And I'm very pleased to kick off the afternoon session of the International Institute's Collaborative Conference on the Arts of Devotion. So if you joined our morning session, we welcome you back. And for those just joining us now, I'd like to take a quick moment to orient you with the Zoom webinar interface. So as attendees, your mics are muted and the chat box has been disabled, but we encourage you to submit questions for our panelists in the Q&A box. You can view the full schedule of the conference, speaker bios, presentation abstracts, and a list of the many units that have generously sponsored the event at the link that my colleague Gabrielle will send out in the chat box. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that we have enabled a live transcript, though I believe you can turn this feature off if you wish. So this conference on the arts of devotion brings together U of M national and international scholars for compelling presentations and discussion around various forms of contemporary and pre-modern arts of devotion. And I'm pleased to introduce our second panel of the day, Global Perspectives on Pre-Modern Devotional Arts. Our wonderful moderator for this panel is Dr. David T. Doris, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce him to you now. David T. Doris is Associate Professor of African Art and Visual Culture at the University of Michigan in the Department of History of Art and the Department of Afro-American and African Studies. He received his PhD from Yale University in 2002, was a Fulbright Scholar in Nigeria, and has held residential fellowships at the Center for Advanced Study of the Visual Arts, the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African Art, and the Getty Research Institute. In 2012, his book, Vigilant Things on Thieves, Yoruba Anti-Aesthetics, and the Strange Fates of Ordinary Objects in Nigeria, received the African Studies Association's Melville J. Herskovits Award, presented for the most important scholarly work in African studies published in English during the preceding year. His current book project is provisionally titled A Natural History of Immortality, the Dazzling Erasures of a Yoruba Secret Society, as Viewed by a Sentient Corpse. Well, on behalf of our organizing committee, we're so grateful to David for serving as our moderator for panel 2. And without further ado, I hope you all enjoy this panel, and I welcome David to our session.
Thank you very much, Alana. I'm very honored and very grateful to be here today. Thank you, Alana, and to Gabrielle too for the support that you've shown over the last day or two or three, and for the support, in fact, that you're showing right now. As I believe you in the audience have already learned, I'm not especially hip to technology, and so that can lead to an occasional bumble, but I hope you don't mind. So now you have it at the very least. Faculty meetings can sometimes be no fun. Anyway, I thought I'd begin this panel by introducing you to an extraordinary figure. This figure, called an Aruba, the name means the one who carries the calabash, was a gift that was given to me by the sculptor Lawrence Ayodele, who carved this in 1998. It was a gift from one friend to another. We'd spent a lot of time together. And a finer, more elegant image of devotional attitude, I do not know. A figure such as this in Yoruba culture, southwestern Nigeria, is often given as a gift of gratitude after a certain gift has been given by a divine power. It can often be given in advance of that gift. It is a representation of a single figure at a particular moment in time, that particular moment being right now. A single figure that stands in a conventional gesture, rather she kneels in a conventional gesture, time-honored, that recalls a past, even as it projects the possibility of a future Here, that future represented by a child who might come to bless a life. A full two-handed offering to powers that are not represented in this figure, that are the most important moments within a network of powers in which this portrait of a single person whose name is unknown to us is represented. In Yoruba, the term image is translated as aworan, what we look at and remember. It's an extraordinary translation because it doesn't merely stop at visuality. It suggests that in a significant image, time itself plays a powerful role. An image is something that will impact our consciousness, call us to remember it in the future. It will leave a mark. Likewise, it will prompt us to recall that it came from somewhere, that this object has a history. It was made by an artist who cared for it, presented it. That artist came from within certain institutions that allowed his hand to do the work that it does. It extends beyond that as well. It assumes a shared history. It assumes that the viewer who sees this will have shared enough of a history with the object itself, with that object's creator, and with all of those forces that allow them both to dwell within the social cultural matrix, to recognize their interdependence within that frame. It's a frame that not only unfolds within this moment, but it unravels into the past, to the future, even as it unfolds in the present. Artist Jimo Buraimo said of Yoruba traditional art, he said, our tradition is a very modern tradition. There is, at least in Yoruba thinking, not that stark divide that has for so long been inscribed between the traditional and the modern. But even within the notion of tradition, choice, selection, novelty, these are absolute parts. These are absolutely central parts of its unfolding. So what we're looking at here is a single moment of devotion. We can address modernism, we can address tradition, large issues, large powers at work in the world. But at its core, a single object representing the hopes, the prayers of a single person, representing a moment of submission, if you wish, to those hierarchies, but also a reciprocative intent, the expectation that desires will be met, an image that overflows beyond itself through space and time. There's much more that I could say about that, but now's probably not the time. What I can say is that every student up till the coronavirus, every student that I had had in a seminar had touched it, held it, had approached it in a way that often museums do not allow. And it's that sense of touch, of contact, of engagement that I have found exceptionally rewarding. I believe students have as well. And it's the reason that this Aruba, this one who is performing the labor of sacrifice, the labor of worship in anticipation of something better to come, an act of perfect devotion, why she's been on my shoulder this past year. So here's to you. So our panelists today include Suzanne Davis from the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology here at the University of Michigan, Brendan McMahon of the Department of the History of Art, an assistant professor here at the University of Michigan, Lihong Liu, who is the Sally Michelson Davidson Assistant Professor of Chinese Arts and Cultures right here at the University of Michigan, Adrian Diese, who is an LSA Collegiate Fellow in the Department of Afroamerican and African Studies here at the University of Michigan, and Orna Sultan, who is a scholar of Mongolian art and culture, the Edgar and Dorothy Fennell Chair in International Studies and assistant professor at Indiana University's Herron School of Art and Design. I will introduce them a little more fully in a few minutes, but first I'd like to call forth a short video from an important partner for this program, UMMA, the University of Michigan Museum of Art. The film, 7 minutes long, features Natsu Oyube, the curator of Asian art there. So I hope you enjoy this film.
Hello, my name is Natsu Oyube. I'm curator of Asian art at the University of Michigan's Museum of Art. Today, I'd like to introduce one object from our collection of Asian art, which contains more than 6,000 objects. And we have 4 permanent galleries dedicated to Asian art at the UMMA. And currently it's open only to the University of Michigan staff and students, but we hope to open to the public pretty soon. So the object I chose is the small container used for tea, or Japanese art of drinking tea called wabicha, or more commonly known as tea ceremony. Wabicha was a secular practice, but many aspects of wabicha came from Zen Buddhism. And the major tea practitioners, such as Senno Rikyu, were all Zen practitioners. And one important aspect which came from Zen Buddhism was a reverence for objects and their histories and lineages that associate with masters in the past. So this humble-looking small tea caddy is a really excellent example. So drinking powdered tea came to Japan in the 12th century from China, Song Dynasty China, and tea bowls and other tea-related utensils were imported. In China, the small ceramic containers such as this were used to store medicine. But when they came to Japan, some of them began to be used for storing tea powder. And in the mid-16th century, as wabicha became very popular among the military class, Buddhist clergies, and wealthy merchants, copies of Chinese tea caddies were started to be made in Japan. And this tea caddy was made by a Japanese potter named Seto Shinrei. And it was later named by contemporary tea practitioner and warlord himself, Kobori Enshu. And these rarefied tea utensils often have names given by people who made them, or oftentimes in this, Kobori Enshu's case, owned. And so these names, were given by the makers and tea practitioners. And this tea caddy's name, Hitorine, means sleeping alone. And Enshu composed a poem, a classical poem, about the person longing for his or her absent lover. And so sleeping alone is really appropriate in the context of the poem. So when presented in tea room, the tea caddy such as this will be enveloped by a silk pouch. So we have two of them here, and so the tea practitioner would choose one of them. So this tea caddy is about 3 inches high, and there's a sort of overall brown glaze, and there's a black glaze on the shoulder, and those are really randomly, very sort of quickly applied. And the bottom of this tea caddy is not totally flat, so it wobbles on even tatami mat. And if you look at the ivory lid, there's a insect hole and tarnished and damaged in a way. Also, if you look at the mouth, it has a chip after the bisquiring, but the potter didn't, mind about that and applied the glaze anyway. So all these damages and irregularities were considered actually beautiful in the wabi-cha setting. So how important this tea caddy is, you can tell from the layers of boxes and cases and bags. And for this tea container, there are 5 of them. And in each case has some kind of inscriptions. And on the left, you see one of the lid of the one box. And it has the name Hitorine in Chinese character. And the back side of it, there's a poem composed by Kobori Enshu. It also has 2 letters of authentications that this poem written by, supposedly written by Enshu was Enshu himself. And Kobori Enshu was really important, very influential figure in the early to mid part of 17th century. He was a warlord himself, but he became a tea master, serving for important, rulers of Japan that time. First Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and then later Tokugawa Ieyasu was the founder of the Tokugawa government. So in the tea room, a tea caddy such as this will be presented before the host enters the room and greet the guests. And before making tea using a silk cloth, the tea caddy would be cleaned in the uttermost careful manner, as seen in this image. And you can really see the sort of affection of this tea practitioner, with his very intent gaze. So oftentimes in American museums, the way objects, context, and history become lost. And because the boxes or documentations have been discarded. But this tea caddy was a really rare case, and these accessories were kept intact and really make us aware of tremendous devotional value attached to this object. So I'd like to thank again to the, I'd like to thank International Institute for this opportunity for me to talk about this important object in our collection. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed that presentation. And now, let's get to the main menu. Suzanne Davis is the Associate Curator of Conservation at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology here at the University of Michigan, where she oversees preservation of the museum's 100,000 plus ancient artifacts, as well as the historic building itself. She directs conservation efforts for several Kelsey excavation projects, including El Kuru and Jebel Barkal, Sudan. With Jeff Emberling, she is co-curator of the recent exhibition, Graffiti as Devotion Along the Nile, as well as author and co-editor of the accompanying anthology. Her research interests include ancient craft production, archaeological conservation, and visitor and community experience of archaeological sites. Suzanne Davis's presentation is entitled Graffiti as Social Devotion in Ancient Sudan.
Hi, everyone. Just gonna take a second to share my screen with you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, David. Okay, I hope that's looking good for you. So thanks again, David, for that introduction. And I think some of the things that you said at the very beginning of this session, I hope we will hold them in our mind during this talk. Specifically, the image is something we look at and remember. I am thankful also to the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies for inviting me to be part of this event, and to the conference organizers for putting it all together. And today it's my pleasure to introduce you to graffiti as an art of devotion, specifically graffiti inscribed by everyday people living about 2,000 years ago in what's now northern Sudan. So Sudan is in the upper northeast part of Africa, and at that time the area was known by its local name of Kush. And to give you some background for the graffiti, Kush was Sub-Saharan Africa's earliest empire, and its kings controlled major trade routes and resources. The empire was long-lived, and throughout its life, the Kushites and their neighbors, the ancient Egyptians, had ongoing cultural exchange while also battling for political dominance in the region. Kushite kings controlled Egypt for about 100 years, where they ruled as its 25th dynasty. And King Tamutamani, pictured at right, is the last king of that dynasty. He was forced out of Egypt by the Assyrian army in around 650 BCE. The Kushite kings and queens would continue to rule the Kushite homeland, which is shown in the map at left in orange, for more than 1,000 years. And before we go into more details about the history and archaeology of Kush, I thought it would just be nice to have a sense of the landscape. So here you see a view of the Fourth Cataract region. This is one of 6 rocky, unnavigable parts of the Nile, and it's right in the middle of the area that we'll talk about today. And as you can see, the landscape is verdant right next to the river, but once you're past the area that can be easily irrigated, you're in the desert. And to illustrate that, here we've gone 25 kilometers east of the Nile Valley to the desert site of Musawwar as-Sufra, and you can see how rugged and inhospitable the landscape is here. And camels are not introduced here until about 200 CE, making travel even more difficult. So that's just something to keep in mind. Most of what we know about ancient Kush comes from archaeological excavations. And until recently, most archaeological work has focused on a few big royal and religious sites, such as Jebel Barkal. This site was a major Kushite religious center with multiple temples and palaces. And Kushite religion had a lot in common with religious practice in ancient Egypt, while also retaining gods, goddesses, and art forms that were particular to Kush. The site of El Kuru has also received a lot of attention from archaeologists. It was a royal cemetery for the Napatan dynasty. That's that line of kings who conquered Egypt. This site is shown here at upper right in a drone photo, and then below that in a digital reconstruction showing its many pyramid tombs for Kushite kings and queens. I'll also mention 2 more sites that were important in the last phase of Kush, beginning in about 300 BCE. This period of time is known as the Meroitic period, after its capital city of Meroe. And at top right, you see the Royal Pyramid Cemetery at Meroe. And at bottom right, here again is the huge temple site of Musawwar as-Sufra. And because most archaeological excavations haven't yet focused intensively on cities or towns, it's harder to know much about the lives of non-elite people. However, during this last phase of the Kushite Empire, from about 300 BCE to 300 CE, an interesting thing starts to happen. During the Meroitic period, people in Kush began to carve graffiti at a few major religious and cemetery sites: Musawwar as-Sufra, El Kuru, Khazar Ibram, and Philae. And by graffiti, I mean unsanctioned images and text, so things that are not part of any official decorative scheme, but that are carved onto the walls of public buildings by visitors. Meroitic graffiti probably have their roots in a much older tradition of rock art that flourished in the 4th and 5th Cataract regions. So this tradition is very old. It dates back to the Neolithic period, and it appears in the Cataract regions where people traveling by water had to exit in portage, giving them good opportunities to make a mark on the landscape. Rock art mostly depicts animals, but there are also rock gongs, where cup-shaped depressions in the rock can be struck to produce a bell-like ringing tone. This local tradition of leaving marks at key places in the landscape is probably one that informs the rise of Meroitic graffiti thousands of years later. We know that Meroitic graffiti are devotional not only because of where they're located at major temples and cemeteries, but also because of what they depict. So for example, Musawwar Sufra seems to have been a center for worship of the Kushite lion-headed god Abidemek. He's depicted in official temple decoration like you see in the center photo. And then all over the site are lion graffiti like you see at right that seem to have been carved by religious pilgrims. Musawwar Sufra has thousands of graffiti, and archaeologists have documented themes of religion and religious objects, animals in the natural world, and people who are dressed like priests. And we know that these graffiti were carved while the site was in regular use, and they're usually carved on the outside of temple buildings, not the inside, so the exterior surfaces must have been more accessible to pilgrims. The sheer number of graffiti at this site suggests that graffiti making was seen as a normal part of a visit to the site. Much farther north, at the frontier of the empire with Egypt, devotional Meroitic graffiti are present at 2 sites: the island of Philae, which was home to multiple temples, and the site of Khazar Ibram, which throughout its history was sometimes a temple and sometimes a military fort. In contrast to Musawwar Sufra and El Kuru, graffiti at these sites include text like people's names and sometimes also prayers. So for example, from Philae, on the left, you see a prayer that's inscribed in the stone wall of a gate. And graffiti like this were inscribed for pilgrims by priests who often signed their names. Pictorial graffiti at this site includes images related to pilgrimage, things like boats and feet, as you see at right. But as at Musawwar Sufra, images of animals and religious objects are also common. So my interest in all of this comes from work to document and preserve graffiti at the Royal Kushite Cemetery of El Kuru, which is most famous as the burial place for the Napatan dynasty, that line of kings who conquered Egypt. So since 2014, I've worked with the University of Michigan team that's led by archaeologist Jeff Emberling, and that team has been part of an international effort to study this site. Our work has included preservation of a subterranean funerary temple that was built to honor the king who was supposed to be buried in the site's largest pyramid tomb, which is known as Kuru I. And you see the temple and the pyramid both in this image on the left. The temple and Kuru I were built in the later 4th century BCE, but for reasons that we don't fully understand, they were not completed. So unlike the temples at the other sites we've talked about, this one was unfinished, it was abandoned, and there's no evidence that it was ever used as it was intended. Yet a few hundred years later, it becomes a site for devotional graffiti. The El Kuru graffiti include images of people, of animals, objects, including religious objects, and geometric symbols. The graffiti also include holes, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Most graffiti occur on the temple's columns and on the masonry wall that you see in the photo. Although the graffiti are faded and worn, we can see a variety of images of humans. On the left is a graffito showing 2 archers. Ancient Kush was called the land of the bow by Egyptians, so hunting with bows and arrows was probably an important part of the Kushite world. In the center image are 2 humans, perhaps with an altar between them. And it right is an image of a seated figure with upraised arms. Usually only rulers or very important people are depicted seated like this, so this could be a king or perhaps a god. We also think that this is a blocky depiction of a human, standing next to a special type of altar called a horned altar. We also see traveling on horses. So at left, you see the remains of a very elaborate graffito of a horse and rider. And at right, you see more of a stick figure version of the same thing. Animals, including horses, also appear without people. And here are two horses and a particular type of bird called a guinea fowl. Guinea fowl appear frequently in the graffiti, and they also appear on Meroitic pottery. And the scholar Connie Kleinitz, who works at Musawara de Sufra, has suggested that images like these might relate to a Meroitic universe of folklore and stories that are now lost. The same might be true for images of giraffes, shown here as graffiti and again on a Meroitic pot. And giraffes could not survive in this area today. And although we think the region was not as arid 2,000 years ago, it's still not clear that it could have supported giraffes. So again, these images could relate to folkloric tales of life farther south. Other animals are clearly religious, like this ram who wears the crown of the Kushite ram-headed god Amun, or this horned viper, which is an Egyptian symbol of the underworld. Some animals are more confusing. These horned cattle with human eyes might relate to images of human faces, or maybe even demonic faces. Or they might relate to the Egyptian and Kushite goddess Hathor, who's often depicted facing front with the face of a cow. There are also scenes like this, and I know it's hard to make out, and maybe, frankly, for you, all of these graffiti are hard to make out, but this composition shows a dog chasing a hare. So there's a little dog on the left, and the dog is chasing a little rabbit hare on the right. This scene is carved 3 times at El Kuru and 7 times at Musawara de Sufra. So it must relate to a well-known story or idea. We also see religious objects like the horned altar at left, and at right there's a small offering table of a type that would have been found outside Kushite and Egyptian tombs. And it's shown here with a palm frond, and that composition occurs twice at El Kuru, the offering table and the palm frond together. Some images of objects seem to relate to travel or pilgrimage, like the very faint boats at left and the woven sandal at right. Other objects are harder to interpret, like these textiles or mats. There are about 7 of these depicted at El Kuru. Also confusing are various geometric symbols like these showing an X in a box. There are a lot of these and their meaning is unclear, although we think they might be altars. Then there are holes of all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they're grouped into designs, as in the 2 lines of holes at left, and sometimes they're random, as shown on the column at right. We think that pilgrims were carving these in order to take some of the stone powder with them and maybe even to ingest it. And this is a practice that still occurs at El Kuru, where local women who want to become pregnant will carve out and consume some of the stone powder from the Kuru 1 pyramid. It's just sort of like a good luck practice. And this also occurs with ancient monuments in modern-day Egypt. When you think about the El Kuru graffiti as a group, obvious themes start to emerge. So religion and religious practice being one of them. Here's the ram of the god Amun, an offering table and palm frond, and the human with a horned altar. Pilgrimage and travel are another obvious theme, with boats, horses, and riders, and a sandal. And there are images that probably relate to folklore and local Kushite traditions, with graffiti like textiles, animal stories, and hunters. So together, the graffiti provide a picture of what people are thinking about as they visit the site, and maybe what kinds of activities they'd like to have blessed or remembered. In practice, carving a graffito means that you leave a bit of yourself behind in a powerful place, and perhaps you also take a bit of the site's power in the form of powdered stone home with you when you return. Why El Kuru became a site for graffiti isn't clear. So unlike the other highlighted sites, it wasn't an active religious center, at least not officially. But it was obviously a place where kings and queens were buried, and it may have attracted devotion or remembrance for this reason. It's also interesting to note that graffiti at El Kuru and at Musawara don't include text. And this leads us to the conclusion that pilgrims are ordinary local people who don't read and write. So when there isn't a priest present, people's thoughts and prayers are expressed as pictures. Devotional graffiti are, of course, also common in other parts of the world and in other times. So in Sudan, the practice continues into the Christian period, where prayers and images are carved into the walls of churches. Last but not least, one thing that we haven't talked about is the experience of making these graffiti. So as you've seen, the graffiti are clustered at a few sites, and they're also clustered within sites where graffiti and similar images are often grouped together. So at El-Kuru, different parts of the temple show different themes. The northwest corner, which is pictured at left, has the highest concentration of graffiti on the site, and most of the obviously religious graffiti are grouped here. The images of textiles, on the other hand, appear along the temple's southeast columns. The graffiti are very obviously carved by different hands with different levels of skill, as you see here in the images of the horses. So it seems likely that images depicting common topics were carved at different times by different people, yet placed to be near and in dialogue with one another. It's also likely that people made pilgrimages to sites together. So then and now, it's safer for a human on horseback, in a boat, or on foot to travel in a group when on a nature trek. So this kind of trip was probably one that you made with companions. We also have evidence that other ritual activity was happening at El-Kuru. So when the temple was excavated, archaeologists found large pottery jars that had been placed upside down on the ground around the perimeter of the temple. And I've highlighted two of these pots in the photo. So all of the jars had their bases knocked off, and there was burned material inside them, as if they were being used as lanterns or to burn incense. Analysis of the burned materials inside the jars dates the burning to the 1st centuries BCE and CE. So it seems like group events possibly associated with making graffiti were taking place in the temple during this time. But even if the graffiti were carved by people visiting the temple together, each one is an expression of personal devotion. So highlighted here is the graffito of the sandal, and it's close to the same level where the pots were found. It would be at a perfect height for carving if you were sitting on the sand. To make an image like this, you'd have to choose your spot, plan the design, and then carve it with a tool like a rock or a knife. And you can see in the image of the ram, I hope, that the planning part didn't always go perfectly, since the ram has a faint trace of an extra long body. The El-Kuru sandstone is soft, so it's not difficult to carve, but it would still take time. And I know this because I've tried doing it myself on chunks of non-archaeological rock from El-Kuru. The process is very repetitive and it's quite meditative. Your brain enters this quiet state that feels soothing and restorative. So in summary, these ancient graffiti are expressions of personal and social devotion in many different ways. They're associated with personal pilgrimage to religious centers and other places of power in the landscape. They're devotional in the kinds of things they represent, images referencing religion, folklore, and the act of pilgrimage itself. And there's the meditative state that carving a graffito engenders in its maker. But their making is also highly social. Careful placement of images puts them in contact and dialogue with other pilgrims' graffiti. And there's a social dimension to their production, since both the pilgrimage and the carving of graffiti were most likely carried out in groups. Although the graffiti are now worn and often difficult to interpret, they nevertheless give us a sense of the lives and informal religious practices of individuals in ancient Kush. So in closing, my thanks to my research partner on this project, Jeff Emberling, as well as the staff of the International Kuru Archaeological Project, especially the archaeologist Sami El Amin and the National Corporation of Antiquities and Museums in Sudan. The El-Kuru Graffiti Project has had financial support from a variety of institutions and individuals, including the Qatar Sudan Archaeological Project, Ms. Kathleen Picken, and multiple departments within the University of Michigan, including the College of Alisane, UM's Office of Research, and the African Heritage and Humanities Initiative, as well as the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. Finally, if this topic was of interest to you, there's an entire book about it, which you can download for free from the Kelsey Museum's website. And we also have an online exhibition where you can explore the site of El Kuru and its graffiti. And Gabrielle will drop links to both of these into the chat for you. So thank you so much. I'm gonna sort out my screen sharing situation here. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Brendan McMahon. Brendan is assistant professor in the Department of the History of Art, right here at the University of Michigan. Prior to his appointment, he held a postdoctoral fellowship with the Michigan Society of Fellows, which he joined after completing his PhD at the University of Southern California in 2017. McMahon is currently revising a book manuscript that explores the cultural histories of iridescent materials in the early modern Spanish world. Dr. McMahon's presentation is entitled The Matter of Impermanence, Taxonomies of Mutable Color in 16th Century Mexico.
Hello, hello, David. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks also to the International Institute, to Alana Rodriguez and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. I'd also like to thank Ofelia Cruz Morales, Blasca Matimiak, for introducing me to the language of Nahuatl many years ago. That's going to be part of my talk. I'd also, of course, like to thank all of you for coming together and kind of creating this virtual space. I think the conditions that we find ourselves in, kind of daily dissolving into this screen ether, have made me reflect even more deeply about the way in which the arts of devotion are often called upon to materialize that which is immaterial. That's really going to be the focus of my talk today. But also, it's an excuse to look at beautiful images of birds. So Suzanne, I see your beautiful guinea fowl, and I'm raising you some neotropical birds. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Great. The venerated image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, housed today in a massive basilica in Mexico City, is the focal point of both thriving Catholic devotion and ongoing debate. Although art historians have convincingly situated its creation by human hands and the growth of the cult that coalesced around it within the complex socio-political ecosystem of colonial Mexico, it is believed by legions of faithful to be the result of divine facture. As vignettes in the four corners of an early 18th century painted copy of the Guadalupe show, the original image is said to have appeared on the tilma, or cloak, of an indigenous Nahua farmer after a visionary encounter with the Virgin Mary on a hill just north of the modern-day basilica in the year of 1531. In addition to citing historical testimonials like this painting, those who believe in the miraculous origins of the Guadalupe can now point to the findings of several technical examinations of the object that were done over the course of the 20th century. In 1979, and with the full blessing of the Catholic Church, the biophysicist Philip Cerna Callahan subjected the image to infrared analysis in search of scientific evidence of its divine provenance. Despite his turn to advanced imaging technology, one of Callahan's claims was based solely on the eye's appraisal. The skin of the Virgin appeared to change color with alterations in the angle of view. This effect, he wrote, quote, is quite evident on the face of the Virgin and is easily observed by backing away from the painting until the details of the imperfections in the tilma fabric are no longer visible. At a distance where the pigment and surface sculpturing blend together, the overwhelming beauty of the olive-colored Madonna emerges as if by magic, olive-skinned yet white of hue, end quote. This type of directionally specific coloration is most often observed in natural materials like the scales of butterfly wings, beetle carapaces, and the feathers of certain birds, whose apparently dynamic surfaces are described today as iridescent. Because producing this effect, quote, would be an impossible accomplishment by human hands, end quote, Callahan argued that the chromatic oscillations displayed by the Guadalupe were concrete proof of its miraculous origin. Putting aside the validity of this argument, I'd like to point out here that by drawing a connection between the color shifts of iridescence and the Catholic divine, Callahan firmly situated the Guadalupe in a tradition of material devotion with a long history in central Mexico. In fact, substances that produced this effect were a crucial component of the sacred objects made in that region for centuries before and after contact with European invaders in the early 16th century. The blue-green feathers of the resplendent quetzal, whose colors still animate this iconic 16th century Mexica headdress, provide a glimpse into a world of objects and visual experiences that are now mostly lost to us. Yet it nonetheless raises questions about why iridescent materials carried such deep meaning for the Nahuatl-speaking peoples of the Valley of Mexico, more widely known today as Aztecs. More importantly, what might this significance reveal about the landscapes of belief through which those who wore similar objects navigated? My goal this afternoon is to complicate the scholarly narrative that surrounds 16th century Central Mexican understandings of iridescent color by centering responses to its instability. To do so, I turn to the Nahuatl language text of the Florentine Codex, a lavishly illustrated cultural encyclopedia divided into 12 books that was produced through the collaborative effort of Nahua elites and Franciscan missionaries in 1570s Mexico City. By analyzing the ways in which the shifting hues of iridescent materials were described in this text, I situate them within linked taxonomies of mutable color. Reconstructing this rich web of metaphor not only reveals how their unique effects were associated with a range of other visual experiences defined by the sensation of chromatic shift, but also invites a reflection on the centrality of mutability itself to 16th century patterns of Nahua devotion. Scholars have long relied on linguistic evidence to situate the visual phenomenon of iridescence within indigenous American systems of value and meaning. In a groundbreaking article published in 1992, the anthropologist Jane Hill gathered evidence from both oral traditions and alphabetized texts of Udo-Aztecan languages like Nahuatl to argue that iridescent materials were viscerally connected to the concept of the flower world. This sacred state, characterized by charged creative energy that could be manifested in the everyday world through ritual practice, was symbolized by, quote, iridescent natural phenomena like hummingbird feathers, insects, and mollusk shells, end quote, for indigenous cultures throughout what are now the southwestern United States, Mexico, and northern Central America. According to Hill, however, iridescent materials are but one of many categories of brightly colored phenomena that are imbued with similar meanings in the belief systems of Udo-Aztecan language communities. Building on Hill's general conclusion and methodologies, scholars continue to center the brightness of iridescent materials in explorations of their cultural value for indigenous audiences in pre-contact and early colonial Mexico. For 16th century Nahua, they argue, the visual relationship to light that many iridescent materials display connects them to the concept of tonali, a type of numinous solar energy associated with creative potential, intellect, and life force. Recognizing the important symbolic power of highly reflective materials within this Nahua worldview, these scholars suggest that the European missionaries who descended upon central Mexico in the 16th century capitalized on perceived similarities between central Mexican aesthetics of sacrality connected to brightness and the Christian metaphysics of light. Certainly, one characteristic of iridescent materials like this hummingbird feather you see on the left could be glossed as brightness, which here results from light waves reflecting off the successive stacked layers of semi-transparent microscopic melanin granules that make up its surface. Yet focusing exclusively on period reactions to their high degree of reflectance overlooks complex Nahua attitudes towards the mutability of their color, another effect of light interacting with these same ordered structures. And you get a sense of the interactions that I'm speaking about in this diagram here on the left of the screen, in which, depending upon the angles created by the observer, the iridescent material, and the light source, many different colors can be perceived when light waves reflecting off these surfaces are in phase, when they match up, or when they're out of phase, when they cancel each other out. And diagrams are one thing, but I'm going to enlist the help of a video to give you a sense of what some of these chromatic shifts really look like. So here we're looking at the head of a male Anna's hummingbird, native to the US and in the West and to northern Mexico. So situating this specific property within the larger Nahua color world helps us rethink established narratives which reduce the significance of iridescent materials to a function of high reflectance values. But how did authors writing in Nahua tackle the challenges posed by capturing mutable iridescent color in words? Descriptions of a range of neotropical birds from the 11th book of the Florentine Codex, which surveys the flora, fauna, and geology of central Mexico, provide a number of different examples. An entry on the resplendent quetzal, whose English name is derived from the original Quetzalcoatl, describes the male's elongated upper tail covert feathers as, quote, green, herb green, very green, fresh green, turquoise colored, they become green, shoshoia, they become turquoise, they glisten. Here, two techniques seem to evoke the shifts in color that are perceived in the surfaces of iridescent materials over brief periods of time as viewing conditions change. One such strategy makes use of Nahuatl's inceptive suffix, one of 5 verb stem forming suffixes used to express the notion of inception or beginning or entry into a state or condition. Describing the feather of a quetzal using the phrase to become green, as the word shoshoia is translated into English, suggests the sudden perception of greenness where previously there had been none. This seems to correspond directly to the experience of viewing iridescent materials, where a color suddenly appears as viewing geometries align and reflected wavelengths of light reinforce one another. A similar effect is achieved through the process of listing. Attempts to capture the chromatic transformation revealed by changes in viewing geometry are revealed through the successive invocation of various colors. Reading them in sequence, as I've just done, thus mirrors a visual experience in which different hues are perceived over the course of the passage of time. While it is tempting to look to this passage as evidence that the Nahuatlatos who helped to compose this passage employed specific conventions for evoking the shifting hues of iridescence, both techniques also appear in descriptions of feathers whose color is neither structural, produced by structures, nor dependent on the geometries of view. In a subsequent passage from the same description of the quetzal in the Florentine Codex, the authors turn their attention to the feathers of its breast, whose rich red color is the product of carotenoid pigmentation. In the Nahuatl text, they are described as chili red. They become chili red, they become rosy, they are resplendent, glistening, end quote. So despite the fundamental differences in the ways in which these two types of feathers from the same bird produce the sensation of color, the same grammatical construction of modifying the color word with the inceptive suffix and the listing of different hues is used to describe both. Excuse me. Even the words that seemingly correspond to the brightness and reflectivity of iridescent feathers, such as pepetlaca and xoxotla, are also used in reference to the pigment-rich plumage of its crimson breast. The lack of a devoted system for recording the shifting colors of iridescent materials in these passages from the Florentine Codex prompts a consideration of the ways in which Nahuatl language texts deal more generally with the problem of describing hue. Perhaps most obviously, distinguishing the directionally specific coloration of iridescent materials from other vibrant substances requires a color system in which boundaries exist between the visual experiences that we associate with certain wavelengths of light. While there is some debate as to the way in which the differences between colors was articulated in Nahua representational systems, linguistic analysis reveals that boundaries between certain hues lack the rigid distinction that they do in Spanish or English. Today's speakers of Uto-Aztecan languages who invoke the experience of perceiving these colors frequently exhibit what linguists term crossover. This phenomenon, which has been observed in the identification of blue and green by native speakers of these languages, involves the application of color terms interchangeably. So word choice has less to do with the expression of a certain category of hue than it does with the perception of similarity and difference within this larger tonal range. As Molly Bassett and Jeanette Peterson have pointed out, similar studies suggest that the color black was also directly associated with green and blue in this linguistic context. Such approaches highlight the problems inherent in using color systems derived from European categories as a comparative metric. The shifts of color in a quetzal's tail feather described today in English as iridescent, that is oscillating between black and brown when out of phase and kind of blue and intense green when in phase, express an association between hues whose relationships are clear in the Nawa color world. This relationship was constantly reinforced by quotidian non-iridescent visual evidence in which material carriers of these hues, such as dark volcanic soil, water, chlorophyll-rich plant life, were intrinsically related through ephemeral processes that unfold over time. Another tangible example of a visual experience that reinforces color relationships which move between European categories of hue in quick succession is provided by fire and its material components. The shifting colors of combusting organic matter and resulting flames, which typically modulate between black, orange, yellow, red, and even blue in relation to material and atmospheric conditions. In fact, these experiences are consistently invoked through metaphor in the text of the Florentine Codex in order to convey the visual appearance of a number of different bird species. The range of colors perceived in the iridescent gorget, the throat of a hummingbird species known as a totos catleton, for instance, is described by invoking fire, or tlet. Quote, "It is ashen, ash-colored at the top of its head and the throat, its feathers are flaming like fire," end quote. Describing the hues perceived in these feathers as a succession of specific viewing angles using this metaphor is particularly apt because the other plumage of the bird is likened to ashes, which is of course the byproduct of material combustion. The flickering colors of fire, however, are not only deployed in this text to convey the visual experience of shifting hue and iridescent feathers. In the case of two other bird species, behavioral traits related to habitual motions performed by both influence how their colors are perceived and, in turn, how they are described. One bird whose appearance is evoked through metaphorical relationships to fire is the quatezcat, a bird that thrives in wetland environments by wading and swimming through shallow, brackish waters on strikingly yellow legs. The text described these gangly appendages using the term that closely maps onto the English word for yellow, kostik, but amends this description by noting that, quote, "When it swims, when it paddles with its feet in the water, it looks like an ember, tlesochtli." As this bird moves through the water, the experience of observing its bright yellow legs appear and disappear in the varying depths of murky liquid echoes the flickering hues of an ember as it flares and fades. A similar device is used in the description of a bird called the saguan. Like the previous example, associating the species with unstable color relies on knowledge of the typical behavior of the birds themselves. In this case, the passage relates to movements produced by the bird's tail feathers. Comprised of two main layers of plumage, the topmost is made up of two feathers that fade from chestnut brown to a deep black, that when perched, obscure bright yellow plumes underneath. When the bird flies, these yellow feathers are exposed, spread outwards like a fan, a visual experience that's captured in the Nahuatl text. When it spreads its tail, then the yellow shows through. The black ones show splendor, radiate like a flame, like embers, like gold, they show through, end quote. As with the legs of the quatezcat, such metaphors only make sense when the bird is observed in motion, as the saguan engages its yellow tail during in-flight maneuvers. The use of fiery matter to describe these three vibrant birds suggests that, for Nawa viewers, they were conceptually linked by the shifting colors they produced, regardless of the specific nature of their coloration. Because visual experiences which reinforced relationships between color spectrums ranged from black, red, orange, and yellow, and black, blue, and green could be found in non-iridescent and iridescent materials alike, the articulation of a specific category of materials defined by their directionally specific hue apparently had little utility. Yet rather than signaling the unimportance of these substances, such capacious taxonomies suggest that iridescent materials were valued precisely because of their connection to these larger patterns of visible resilience. Mutability in all its forms was central to early 16th century Nawa conceptions of reality itself. Drawing on evidence from a wide range of sources, scholars argue that the Nahua conceived of the cosmos as existing in a succession of different eras, each of which ended in destruction and rebirth. As the relief carvings in the center of the monumental Mexica sunstone show, at the time of the European invasion, the Nahua peoples who inhabited the Valley of Mexico believed they were living in the fifth era, known as Nahui Olin, or four movement, which would eventually come to its end in a cataclysmic earthquake. Existence was thus understood to be fleeting and ephemeral, characterized by cycles of creation and destruction. Bearing this in mind, the color shifts perceived in iridescent materials like the plumes of the Quetzalcoatl did more than materialize important patterns of chromatic relationships that were visible in the natural world. They embodied the very transient cycles that were a condition of reality itself, simultaneously reinforcing beliefs about the ephemeral nature of reality, while momentarily crystallizing that mutability in a material that could be worked into temporary assemblages of staggering dynamic beauty. As the anthropologist Daniel Miller noted several decades ago, artists working in service of countless faith traditions across the world paradoxically lean heavily on the tangible stuffs of material reality in an attempt to express that which is ineffable. For the Franciscan missionaries who first encountered feather objects in central Mexico, the shifting colors of the plumage that covered their surfaces suggested that they could serve as an ideal medium for the creation of devotional images to further their evangelical goals. Because the missionaries considered the indigenous populations to be prone to idolatry, applying the techniques of featherwork to the image of European prints produced a potent tool. Images like this Immaculate Conception, created by indigenous artists sometime in the 17th century, seemed to dematerialize as their colors shifted, thereby underscoring the illusory nature of the sensual world. These ideas undoubtedly became untangled with Nahua understandings of transient colors, yet their apparent similarity belies fundamental differences. Whereas the significance of color's transience for European missionaries lay in its ability to call attention to the fictions of the senses and the immutable nature of the world to come, Central Mexican thought held up the shifts in color displayed by iridescent materials as a tangible truth. As the survey of taxonomies of mutable colors in 16th century Nahuatl texts has revealed, the value of iridescent substances was deeply connected to the variable viewing experiences they provided, which embodied the dynamic flux of life itself. Like Cerna Callahan as he gazed at the shifting hues in the face of Guadalupe, to see iridescence was to believe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brenda. To our next speaker then. Lihong Liu is the Sally Michelson Davidson Assistant Professor of Chinese Arts and Cultures at the University of Michigan, right here in Ann Arbor. She studied Buddhist and Taoist arts at Peking University and Chinese paintings and material and visual culture of the Ming and Qing periods, 1368 to 1911. Big swath of time, at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, where she earned her doctorate. Her current research concerns the interaction between art and environment, transcultural studies of material media, and the art of simulation and automation. Her presentation is entitled Vitreous Containers and the Aura of Religious Objects.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. Glass containers as a type of object has been studied in terms of their instrumental functionality. My presentation today deals with glass containers by focusing on their uses as integral components in devotional objects. By considering the materiality and the mediality of glass containers, I specifically look at how they were used in Buddhist objects. In a Buddhist context, different types of glass had been used as precious and miraculous vessels. In the earlier periods, we have glass vessels coming from the Mediterranean and the Islamic worlds. For example, on the right-hand side is a Suzanne glass ball discovered in a tomb in the Northern Wei period in China. The same type of glass appears to be depicted in a Buddhist banner painting of the 9th century, discovered in Dunhuang. In this painting, a bodhisattva holds a Suzanne type glass ball in her right hand. The round ball, tinted with greenish color, echoes the inner circle of the halo around the bodhisattva's head, also in light green. An outer circle extends such echoing, depicted with azure opalescent luster. The glass ball and these spherical halos also correspond to the see-through garments draping the body of the bodhisattva. Glass bottles were used to contain the Buddha's relics. For example, in this set, the glass bottle is the final container containing the Buddha's relic. It is encased with multiple layers of golden reliquaries, which indicates that the glass bottle, as the ultimate container of the sacred substance, is vital to its content. These examples show that glass as a generic category of material, like other luminous goods, had been consecrated for a sense of auric emanation manifested by its visionary dazzle and material marvel. In the early modern period, around the 15th century, the Venetian glassmakers utilized the raw materials imported from the Levant and they started to make crystal glass. Crystal glass and its technology were then subsequently spread across Europe and went to China through long-distance trade and the Jesuit missionaries. By the end of the 17th century, glass factories were established in both at the Qing Court and in Canton in China. The production of crystal glass fostered new ways of using glass in architectural spaces and interior display. Transparent glass was used to cover precious or devotional objects as integral parts of the assemblage. Called boli zhao in Chinese, it refers to glass coverings or surrounds. The term zhao is the same term used to describe architectonic surrounds that are perforated. The term zhao also refers to ethereal phenomena such as fog or smoke. In the Qing palaces, glass coverings and wooden architectural surrounds were coordinated in order to both conceal and reveal the spaces and objects, creating formal codification. In the picture on the lower right, there are 3 cubic vitrines in a space framed by the decorative clapboard. The vitrines contain miniature objects of display. The glass coverings were mounted with wooden strips and bases in order to delineate their otherwise indistinct visual forms with an architectonic silhouette, which either accentuate their formal signification or afforded formal contrast to their contents. Glass containers take shape according to the form of the contents. Instead of concealing the object's content, the transparent glass containers create an augmentative impact of their visibility by reflecting light, which enhances visual attraction. At the same time, because the materiality of the containers affords a tendency of self-negation, the instrumental centrality of the container is transformed to be peripheral, formulating a bubble sphere. In the case of containing devotional objects, this optical phenomenon manifests the emanating force of the content. This is a set of devotional offerings made during the Yongzheng reign in the 18th century. Inside the glass coverings, the contents are variously made of precious stones, corals, pearls, ivories, sparrows, field-grade golden leaves, and so on. As a set, the 5 varied offerings, which syncretize Buddhist and Taoist items, are uniformly set in enameled plates rimmed with lotus petal designs. Glass coverings are impeccably placed at the conjoint seams between the plates and the bases of the contents. Like the plates, the crystal glass surrounds are designed uniformly. They are topped with removable lids made of ruby-colored glass materials, although 2 of them are missing now. The display of the whole set presents a largely symmetrical arrangement, with the central container making the axis. The central stupa, or container, contains an ornate scriptural pedestal supporting the wheel of the Dharma. Next to the central one, respectively on its right and the left sides, the contents within the 2 glass coverings represent the sacred mountain Meru, the sacred 5-peaked mountain of Buddhist cosmology. Both mountains are made of green ivory. Their surfaces are decorated with auspicious and cosmic symbols and carved with water wave patterns. The whole set appears to be a variation of the 5 sacred offerings, or wugong in Chinese, which had long existed in religious worshiping spaces, including Taoist, Buddhist, and vernacular altars in China. While wugong varied over time and in different settings, the conventional set includes a tripod in the center, 2 lamps on each side of the centerpiece, and 2 vases with boutiques on the 2 ends, as seen in the altar in the Qianlong period's private garden. Here, all 5 vessels are made of green jade. Originating in Taoist cult, wugong functioned as a material offering to a deity, with the tripod holding foods, lamps illuminating the space, and emitting incense, and the flowers and the fluids filled with the energy of life, as well as aromas. Together, they enable worshippers to commune with the divinity. In this offering space, the shrine panel represents and presents 8 standardized round mini niches enshrining painted clay votive figurines, known in Tibetan Buddhism as tata, that portrays deities, protectors, preachers, and lineage holders. Covered with glass, some are now missing, so all the niches are covered with glass plates. Those niches surround a multi-story, 9-niched treasure tower in the center. The central, largest and flame-shaped niche in the tower contains a golden statue of Qianlong as Manjushri, the emperor as the bodhisattva of wisdom. The glass covers that view the recesses of the Tata figurines manifest the revelatory emanations of the imperially sanctioned Buddhist lineages, which also enhancing their emanating forces. The standardized shape and the size of the glass covers, the glass covered niches create a constellation of trans-temporal lineage figures in a unified space dominated by the emperor incarnating Manjushri. The planar surfaces of glass mediated objects and images in space while materializing undulations of light. In a process of visual metamorphosis, surfaces and spaces interfuse with one another in a mutating ambience. Auratic form takes shape of a stupa in the 5 offerings. The stupa is an archetypical structure of cosmogenesis and enlightenment in Buddhism. It means pile or heap in Sanskrit, originally referring to a solid hemispherical dome. The dome, called garbha in Buddhist texts, means womb, embryo, or container. It contains the world in potential, but also is the world. Container and the content are one. The stupa attained its iconic potency for the spread of Buddhism and was replicated across media, both in situ in monasteries and as portable monuments. In the case of portable stupas made of translucent or transparent materials, the idea of multiplication and immanation became materialized in their making and perception. This idea had already been realized in early Indic miniature stupas that combined the miraculous material of rock crystal with symbolic form and function of the stupa as reliquary, as seen in an example dated to the 1st century BCE. This pure rock crystal stupa container simultaneously monumentalizes the reliquary as an architectural form and miniaturizes the stupa as a container of sacred relics. It represents the prototypical early Indic stupa consisting of a foundation, a dome, and umbrellas upheld at the summit. In the 5 offerings, the architectonic elements of a stupa are represented respectively by the rolled rim plate, the glass cover, and the lid. The glass containers emulate the stupa form by fitting their contents. As a result, the dome becomes elongated due to the ascending tendencies of the contents, including growing trees, floating clouds, and the rising flora-shaped pedestal. This distorted or rather pliable feature shows that the idea of the stupa is yet again materially reinterpreted. Their own identical structures serialize the 5 varied offerings by replicating the conceptual and the tectonic form of the stupa, creating a rippling array of apparitional emergences, recurrences, and emanations. The contents too signal their dazzling spheres as they represent movements of sorts, including revolving, spinning, surging, floating, branching, and emanating. While crystal glass emulates rock crystal in creating an apparition of its emanating force, it differs thanks to its malleability, being able to more readily privilege the contents of visual forms and active spaces. Materiality coincided with techniques of making as well. The crystal stupa is hand carved, whereas the crystal glass container is breast blown. The latter's more tenuous nature aptly manifests its pneumatic coming into being. This thin, clear, and brittle glass that privileges its content overturns the container's containment gravity, which becomes a peripheral component of the object as a whole. A Tibetan-style glass stupa made during the Qianlong period deploys a similar schema of containment, merging the content with infinite cosmic realms. With its elaborate architectonic structures, this unique glass stupa is assembled from 26 glass components made of both modeled and blown glass. This stupa consists of a dome in the shape of an upturned umbos, in which sits a gilded and enameled Amitayas, or Buddha of infinite light or life. The flame pattern formulates a hollow of the Buddha, surrounded by a glass dome with an arc opening through which we can see the Buddha inside. The flames dissolves into the glass surrounds, which emanate the radiance into a void. The symbols of the conjoined moon and the sun at the summit suggest an infinite continuity of the surrounding. The glass stupa materializes an auratic form that transforms into an immaterial realm of dynamic force. Comparing the Qianlong glass stupa to a gilded copper stupa, we see interesting correspondences and contrasts. In the copper stupa, the dome is perforated, while the niche is closed with a piece of nephrite. The perforated wall is decorated with sparkling glass beads. The lustrous nephrite substitutes for the presence of the gilded Buddha as seen inside the glass stupa. At the same time, the flames surrounding the Buddha in the glass stupa are now on the frame of the door in the copper stupa, surrounding the nephrite. It is obvious that the nephrite stands for the Buddha in the copper stupa. I say that these two objects are in dialogue with respect to a set of formal, material, and spatial evocations. The perforated gilded wall decorated with glass beads tends to soften the form of the copper dome, transmuting substantive form into a semi-void space. At the same time, the bulbous nephrite, which is an object of worshiping here, and is supposed to be contained in the dome, now becomes part of the container. This pair shows us that the container and the content are interfused. Their auratic emanation is thus invoked. To sum up, in this talk, I have shown that crystal glass container as a novel artifact in Qing China acted out its functioning of containment as a miraculous material event. I've suggested that glass containers were used to simulate, animate, and amplify the aura of sacred or precious objects. In the context of Qing Dynasty, the prevailing religious and the political visuality of an imperially embodied cosmological power resonated with the modalities of auratic emanation and containment that glass containers expressed. Glass containers in this transcultural process also activated material perception and cultural recognition by shrouding material objects with cultural aura, and by simulating a material and a miraculous aura upon cultural and religious objects. Thank you.
Oops. Okay. Oops. Thank you very much. It's really a wonderful talk. Our next speaker is Adrian Diese. Our next speaker is Adrian Diese, an LSA Collegiate Fellow in the Department of Afroamerican and African Studies, right here at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on the history of interreligious dialogue in 19th century West Africa. He earned a PhD in religious studies from the University of Cambridge quite recently, and earlier received master's degrees in both history and Africana studies from Cornell University. He is a native of Atlanta, Georgia, and received his BA in history at Georgia State University. Dr. Deese was previously a US Fulbright Scholar at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. His presentation is entitled Early Yoruba Religious Tracts as Devotional Arts in Nigeria.
Thank you, David. And I also wanted to thank Gabrielle, the organizers of the conference, as well as the African Studies Center for inviting me to participate in this conference. So as he mentioned, my presentation today, in this presentation, I want to sort of talk about early Yoruba language religious tracts or religious texts. And I want to sort of unpack the visual meaning of these texts. For the past few years, I've done a lot of research on sort of the meaning of the text in terms of the writings, but I want to look at why images will also play a key role in how early Yoruba language authors, and particularly in the region of Southwest Nigeria, why they utilize images to communicate certain things, and what functions that these texts sort of have in their immediate community. One thing I want to sort of lay out here is that I'm arguing that these texts come out of this early evangelical Protestant politics in early British Nigeria relations. And so out of this debate sort of with missionaries and with other local religious actors, I want to argue here that local Yoruba authors employ images in order to create what I sort of call an ethno-religious iconography that would sort of facilitate interreligious dialogue and modes of ethnic and national self-governance in the 19th and early 20th century. So the topic of this paper is drawn from my larger book project, which argues for a new interpretation of the role of the church in the early mediation of power, in political power and authority in what was becoming Nigeria. The Latin American historian Herman L. Bennett has emphasized how central a role the church played in mediating a sacred grammar of ritual authority in the early centuries of African-European relations, and how important those early modern dialogues are to our understanding of every aspect of the Atlantic world as a conceptual framework. And so what we're going to see is that a lot of these authors are kind of part of this wider Atlantic world process that's occurring as well. In my field in particular, this church and state relationship dates back to the early 19th century, the start of the evangelical missions in Sub-Saharan Africa. In Protestant evangelical discourse, this Yoruba town of Abeokuta served as a barometer of British public opinion in terms of what, from the British perspective, what could or what would be done in terms of how Nigeria would be developed. And so Abeokuta and Lagos and this region, I argue, provide us a really great case study for looking at how local African actors negotiated and were very much part of this developing grammar of ritual authority and power that came out of their engagement with the church as an institutional authority. And so Abeokuta was a very early center of what I call a city of God discourse, that southern Nigeria would be developed into a centralized nation built around a sort of archbishopric and federated monarchy in the sort of Western European tradition. And it is out of this community and their debates for and against particular ways of thinking about that process that we get this very complex body of text that I want to give some overview of here. In this presentation, I will posit preliminary ideas of what the visual presentation of early Yoruba religious print may mean as devotional arts. We should view early Yoruba religious print as not simply written text, but also a visual form that mediated religious diversity as it visually wove together a dialogical ethno-religious iconography. The anthropologist Karen Barber has argued that it may be most useful for us to view early Yoruba print as, quote, contributing to the creation of a distinctive early West African civic society that had print culture at its core. I want to expand on Barber's concept to highlight the interreligious dialogical aspect of this civic society that print culture enabled Nigerian writers to develop very early on. The development of a written textual tradition enabled authors to assemble two interrelated components of ethno-religious nationality around the material text. First, they were deeply invested in utilizing the text as a public sphere in itself, drawing on the ability of words and images to bring masses of people into conversation around institutions like kingship and civil obligation in general. And second, the text would serve from their perspective as an art form in itself that may engender devotional loyalty through the invocation of sacred images. Now, of course, in early times, in ancient times, in Africa as elsewhere, religion and communal authority were deeply intertwined. Early Yoruba authors invoked images of various types, such as the ritual motifs drawn from local divination traditions and modern photography, to aid in the production of books and to negotiate traditions of authority. The juxtaposition of sacred icons within any single embroidered text underscored the geopolitical fact of religious diversity against rival claims for ethnic authority. The publication of sacred icons, as a result, became central to early attempts to reconcile royal traditions and a nascent political modernity. And so we see, of course, the more medieval, the ancient traditions of decorated religious texts that I'm arguing that we should also situate modern 19th century and early 20th century religious texts in this wider tradition as well. Although, as we'll see, the circumstances around how print culture is produced diverges a lot from these very elaborate and highly skilled traditions, whether it's Islamic calligraphy that we see on the left or the Ethiopian Orthodox traditions. But one thing we see, for example, in the Ethiopian text is the way in which sort of the Ethiopian monarchy and royal family are sort of read, sort of almost visualized in those biblical sacred figures. And so there's this very old tradition of reading politics and reading traditions of royal authority in relation to wider institutions of sort of world religion. But what happens then with the printing revolution is that it, of course, in Europe, it facilitates the Reformation by giving non-authorized individuals the ability to mass produce information that had traditionally been regarded as a sacred domain of powerful institutions like the church. The proliferation of the famous Gutenberg Bibles in Europe embodied the radical implications of vernacular sacred texts in the early modern West. The printing press led to the gradual decline of those rich illuminated texts of the Middle Ages, but a vast expansion of more cheaply produced texts across the early modern world. The printing press released what copyright scholars Atkinson and Fitzgerald termed a genie of information that has never been returned to its bottle, which, quote, everywhere incited change and invited repression or suppression, government suppression. It is the struggle over sacred information that print culture induced that I would like to use to frame my discussion of the implications of early modern Protestant print culture in Sub-Saharan Africa. Early modern print culture reveals much about African engagements with modernity, from the early exploratory European literature to the 18th century anti-slavery sort of propaganda literature, and culminating in the missionary vernacular literatures of the 19th century and early 20th century. And so we see here the sort of a sort of genealogy of abolition, very evangelical abolitionist literature published in the West, published in Europe, primarily in Britain, as well as some was published in America. But it's during this period that we, for the first time, get a sort of in-depth engagement with West African personages in a visual sense, and having that brought into sort of a modern print culture context. And then out of this period and the evangelical claims of the abolitionist movement then will give rise to the missionary movement at the turn of the 19th century. But we see the usage of images here in Europe and in America with the publication of African persons, such as Daniel Orm's engraved portrait of Olaudah Equiano from 1789, as well as Scipio Moorhead's earlier portrait of Phyllis Wheatley that was published in the 1773 edition of her book as the frontispiece. And of course, the most famous sort of African image in this 18th century literature is Josiah Wedgwood's 1787 "Am I Not a Man and Brother" sort of medallion, which is on the right text. But this medallion image, of course, is published in many different forms in the 18th and early 19th century. So embodied in this evangelical literature were their understandings, the evangelical understandings of Africa, and their ideas on how religious dialogue would mediate the development of modern nation states in Africa. And so with the full success, if you will, of the abolition movement, they then take these ideas into particularly West Africa by the turn of the 19th century. So what might we gain from viewing Africa's textual modernity as a sacred art? It is clear that early West African print culture must be viewed in this context as an outgrowth of the Protestant missionary movement. As an art form, print culture was cheaply produced, easily transported, and less dependent on sort of artistic commissioning as the medieval traditions had been. One important factor of the Protestant movement that was significant for the evangelical project in Africa was that the Reformation churches based their legitimacy on a claim to revive a model of early Christianity based on national sovereignty in church government and the right of ethnic nations to negotiate the ecumenical doctrines of the church on their own terms. The early missionaries in West Africa, therefore, were keenly invested in traditional systems of authority, as it was always assumed that they would form the rightful basis of civic power. Traditional systems of authority in the Yoruba towns of Nigeria was and is based on sacred systems of ritual and kingly authority. In southwestern Nigeria, the Ifa divination cosmological corpus sanctions state and society relations through an extensive repertoire of civic Orisha deities whose existence is ritually predicated on a very rich traditional oral corpus, as well as the Ife Sacred Center, which is a sacred city as a center of the culture. Afolayan and Pemberton have argued that a sacred Yoruba kingship communicated through oral texts and oral literature that have, quote, no archival objectivity, shape present realities through legitimating a person's or group's status, but more often with the purpose of addressing the fundamental human concerns through the articulation of social norms and models for action. So for the first time, when the Yoruba writers pick up these new tools of print culture, they begin to codify ritual traditions of authority as an intervention on what was already an ongoing regime of sectional identity sanctification. Early print culture, therefore, posed an anthropological paradox. The texts were mainly treated as ephemeral, cheaply published in pamphlets or small booklets, ceremonial programs, newsletters, just kind of everyday text, you know. When you actually read them, you see that they could contain very deep religious negotiations. Other than the major official missionary commission works, like Ajayi Crowther's translation of the Bible, very few of these printed texts were really commissioned as great works of literature in the modern sense. Nonetheless, these texts contain the earliest literary works of Western educated Africans who were educated on the continent of Africa. The visual arts served a key anthropological role in negotiating visual culture and announcing the epistemic possibilities of textual literacy. While conducting research in the field in Nigeria, I was often struck by how unproblematic everyday people of different backgrounds viewed the early printed materials. Many explained to me that what these materials meant to them. These texts were, they said, the tangible, written, and visual expressions of their past and national heritage. I want, therefore, to spend the rest of my presentation using early Yoruba printed visual expression to address the question of whether these early printed texts challenge the exercise of royal power, or if print culture, in fact, ensured its survival under modern conditions of civil obligation. I will argue that the publication of sacred images within early print reified modern civil society in Nigeria precisely by transforming the relationship of state and society. The publication of sacred images included unelaborate photographs and ritual motifs that could be easily reproduced for mass consumption, but that would engender de facto reconstructions of the role of the sacred in mediating a mass civil subjecthood. And so, of course, we see Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who is sort of the founder, if you will, of sort of printed Yoruba print culture, as well as the missions, the Yoruba missions, and that sort of thing. And so we see an example of his Yoruba Grammar, which was published in the 1850s. And so most of his texts were not very elaborate, just plain written text. It was not until the 1880s, with the rise of a movement referred to as West African cultural nationalism, that African religious print culture becomes more visually experimental as print culture. And so we see on the cover of the Reverend Lijadu's first important religious publication is a very plain print of the framed capitalized name Ifa of the deity and the divination system. In the second page is a subtitle of the book, which is the light that is the foundation of religious devotion in Yoruba land. Most importantly, Lijadu includes a photograph of himself at the start of the book. It is not clear if he's the first one to do this in Nigerian or in Yoruba literature. Many biographies were published in Europe in the 19th century of Bishop Crowther that included photographs, but this is the earliest that I've found in Yoruba literature that would have been distributed there in Nigeria. It is important to note perhaps the dialogical contrast that Lijadu makes in including the capitalized name of the Ifa deity alongside his portrait in priestly robe and collar. His following text, the Orunmila, provides one of the most provocative selections of sacred images in all of early Yoruba print. This Orunmila treatise, the Nigerian scholar and clergyman E.A. Adegbola argued, is so important to their heritage because it represents a genuine expression of interreligious dialogue in achieving ecclesiastical and royal reciprocity. Clearly, Lijadu employed ritual motifs and modern photography to great effect in this book to communicate some dialogical message or meaning to his audience, even if those meanings may not be all clear to us who are not his primary audience. We see the Reverend Lijadu seated in the center of the Yoruba divination instrument, flanked by sacred icons of the deity Eshu on each side of him. The quadrangular divination tray sketched on Lijadu's book is not unlike the circular one to the right, dated from the early 20th century. The frontispiece of the Orunmila includes a photograph of Lijadu seated in a position of studious deference to a Babalawo ritual priest in the sacred grove. The Babalawo almost appears not so much as his ethnographic informant, as so much as a spiritual teacher or spiritual guru, with Lijadu seated as his pupil. I pose the question because there is no, I think, clear answer. Do these images signify a shared and unified national destiny? Or is that what Lijadu wants us to think that these images signify? The dedication of the Orunmila includes a photograph of the British clergyman Reverend Thomas Harding and his wife, Mrs. Harding. Lijadu's dedication includes a lengthy description that gives some idea of why a photograph was so important here. He emphasizes that he wants his audience to understand the importance of the British clergymen like Harding coming to live in Nigeria and devoting their lives to helping local people. The photograph thus signified Lijadu's point about racial difference and provided a very humanized Victorian image of the Harding family. We see in this text, therefore, that Lijadu was in dialogue with local and global religious communities that reflected his own religious commitments by necessity. He used images to humanize the indigenous religious priests, as well as the foreign British clergy, and to communicate the centrality of each to an emerging civic culture that he anticipated. I want to end just by browsing through some later examples of what I would call sort of Yoruba printed textual arts of devotion. These early texts were written in a variety of genres, and they all sort of share their origins in this very small community that lived between the Abeokuta and Lagos corridor in southwest Nigeria. So we see here Isaac Babalola Thomas, the author of the first Yoruba novel, utilized photography in his 1924 treatise, the Olodumare, dedicated to the clergyman, the Reverend Stephen Abiodun. Similarly, Ajishafe used photography in his biography of the Alake, the King Badebo. Traditionally, the Egba kings were sacred, and their face was not supposed to be seen by the public. Ajishafe's publication of the king's image helped to make familiar to his mass audience the late charismatic figure as he summed up what he felt were the benefits as well as the limitations of his reign. The mystique of kingship, therefore, was made more dialogically tied to a mass public who, in theory, they served. Kings were no longer regarded then as simply divine, but had been brought into a sort of sacred public sphere, if you will, of dialogue and reciprocity. And so they were also then recognized as being figures, Ajishafe argues, who are accountable to us, to the public, to this public. And finally, we see here a sort of World War II era Ifa divination tract. These early writers were pioneering the publication of sacred verses from the vast oral corpus. We see on the top of the front cover the digital markings, which for the initiated identified the sacred verses. To the right, we see anthropologist William Bascom's would later publish in an academic study these same sort of markings that had already been first published in the local Nigerian press of the late 19th and early 20th century. So just to conclude, I have argued in this paper that early religious print culture in Nigeria belongs to a wide global history of the printing press revolution, as well as the history of decorated sacred literature. The printing press and the Protestant Reformation provided an impetus of an early Yoruba language ethno-religious print culture concerned with negotiating religious diversity, as well as reforming sacred systems of authority. The ethno-national claims of Protestantism made it possible for these authors, as Christians, to discursively negotiate and claim Christian orthodoxy on their own terms, which entailed for them a full iconographic engagement with their indigenous religious culture. Print culture was transformative because it facilitated the democratization of knowledge and information. The usage of sacred images, icons, and photographs enabled Nigerian and Yoruba authors to communicate esoteric concepts in a newfound public sphere. In so doing, they pioneered the articulation of indigenous African religious traditions, as well as African Christianity, West African Christianity, as world religions, and publishing photographs of sacred political figures like kings and ritual priests. They made public figures who were traditionally removed from their subjects more familiar and more accessible. Finally, early Nigerian authors pioneered religious dialogue as a model of consensual civic obligation in their communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Okay, there we go. Thanks very much, Adrian. It's a wonderful talk, very compelling. I'd like to just invite those who are listening or watching right now to ask questions. There's a Q&A box right down below where you can ask whatever questions you wish, and I'll be sure to pass them on. Our next speaker, the final speaker of this panel, will be Orna Tsultem, who's a scholar of Mongolian art and culture. She's Edgar and Dorothy Fainall Chair in International Studies and Assistant Professor at Indiana University's Heron School of Art and Design. Orna's publications include 6 books in Mongolia, and she has written catalog essays for exhibitions at the Fukuoka Asian Art Museum in Japan, the Ethnography Museum in Warsaw, Poland, and 2 museums in Finland. She's most recently published articles in journals such as South Asian Studies, Artibus Asiae, Third Text, and Cross Currents. Her monograph, A Monastery on the Move, Art and Politics in Later Buddhist Mongolia, was published just months ago by the University of Hawaii Press. So congratulations. Orna also is an active curator of Mongolian contemporary art. She has organized Mongolian art exhibitions internationally since 1997 at such prestigious venues as the Han Art Gallery in Hong Kong, the 9th Shanghai Biennale, the 56th Venice Biennale, and Sapar Contemporary Gallery in New York City. For her longtime service, in 2016, Orna was awarded an honorary title, Cultural Envoy of Mongolia, by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mongolia. Congratulations. Dr. Tsultem's presentation is entitled From Stone Sculptures to Imperial Portraits, Ancestral Worship and Acts of Devotion in Mongolia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to International Institute and especially to Gabrielle and Evan for inviting me to participate in this wonderful webinar. I'm gonna share my screen now and okay. So here, the topic of my presentation is From Stone Sculptures to Imperial Portraits, Ancestral Worship and Acts of Devotion in Mongolia. So when we look at the acts of worship and devotion in Mongolia, it's a very large and historically very traditional topic. And this presentation is based on my lengthy research that I conducted based on the portraiture of Mongolian emperors currently housed at Taipei National Palace Museum, and the article is coming out this fall. So in the steppes, we have numerous stone sculptures made throughout the time periods. And you see here 2 slides that are showing that objects that are believed to be different types of devotional objects. One is older one here, is prehistoric times from Bronze Age, and this is one in Neolithic age. And some of them, as you see here, are very meticulously carved with different images. And some of them, like this one in northwestern Mongolia, also depict anthropomorphic stone steles known as deer steles, and the images of deer, galloping deer, they are carved across the plains of all around the statues. And the aspect of devotion to these sculptures are not completely clear. There's no textual records around this time. My research placed these images in terms of landscape and environmental studies, but the tradition was a long-lasting tradition, and it continued even the times of steppe empires, such as this one, for instance, even starting from prehistoric times, from these deer steles and going through Turkic state as an example. We see this erection of different types of steles and stone monuments around the steppe, in particular configuration, and in particular conceptual configuration seems to be very important for nomadic communities. And as we saw in prehistoric times in steppe empires, we see also some of these steles, even during steppe empires, they're very meticulously carved, as you see here, and they're also placed with particular iconographic features and in particular cardinal coordination with landscape. But when we come to the Mongol period, imperial period, we see we have a set of Mongol Yuan portraits produced at Yuan court in Beijing, or formerly Datu, as it was named by Kublai Khan. And one of them is this, the earliest one is this one. So my talk concentrates on this portraiture, questioning in what tradition, in what aspect we can study and analyze this portrait. So among the scholars that approached this portrait, specifically, there was no connection between the, as we see here, the stone monuments that are erected throughout the historic times in Mongolia. These ones that you see on this slide, they are erected at the same time as the paintings, the painted portraits in Now House in Taipei were made. So what is the relation between the stone monuments that were made in Mongolia, in northern Mongolia, and the painted portraits that were executed at Yuan court? And what kind of tradition do they relate to? My research consults with recent scholarship by Isabelle Charlot, who is a French scholar on Mongolian Buddhist art. She published 2 articles relating to this Genghis Khan portrait. And Chinese art historian of Yuan China, Shanggang in Beijing, also published a very lengthy article analyzing Yuan portraits as well. Previously, attention to these portraits was placed by several scholars. The earliest was Marshall Widener, who was a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, wrote her dissertation about Mongol imperial portraits, unpublished work. But in that portrait, she also analyzed Genghis Khan's portraits and discovered also records in China. And roughly at the same time in 1980s, Inner Mongolian historian Saishal published 2-volume history book about Genghis Khan specifically. And in that book, he also consults and quotes the textual records that we also find in Marshall Widener's work. And none of these works, however, we see analysis specifically combining the different materiality of these productions and the understanding the Mongolian perspectives in this. So Marshall Widener's dissertation and Saishal's 2-volume book paid attention to Yuanxi. This is the quote from Yuanxi that tells us that there was a name of the person, Holy Hoson, who was ordered by Kublai Khan to sketch Taizu or Genghis Khan's imperial countenance. And that portrait was not the only one that he made, but there was another, the emperor's father, meaning Toloi, the 4th son of Genghis Khan, and the 2nd son, Ugutu's portraits were also made, and all 3 portraits were placed according to this record in Hanling Academy. Now, this name Horgoson or Holy Hoson was discovered further and analyzed further by Saishal, who also found the lineage where Horgoson belonged. And since Saishal, Japanese historians also wrote several articles telling us who Horgoson was. And according to these scholars, Horgoson was an educated scholar gentleman at Yuan court at the service of Kublai Khan, and he was also a high-ranking official at Hanling Academy, where his aim was also to support and maintain Mongolian culture, Mongolian language study, and this is where these 3 initial portraits were placed. Horgoson was at the service of Kublai Khan, and Kublai Khan himself had his several portraits made by his court artists, among whom we learn from Anin Jing. The Anige was one of the very prominent artists who made many productions for Kublai Khan, including, as Anin Jing suggests, this portrait of Kublai Khan made by this artist from Nepal, who served Kublai Khan all his life. Another distinct feature of Mongol portraits is that they are all made with the consorts, with the empresses. And Kublai Khan, for example, is depicted with his 2 major wives. One is Chabi, who was his main wife and who had a very important influence on him, and his second wife, Namboy. And in my research, I suggest that his portrait was sort of flanked between these 2 major portraits of his 2 main wives. While these portraits are made ink and colors on silk and within the Chinese imperial tradition, however, we also find these distinct features such as color spectrum in the portraiture and the attention of the depiction of wives together in these portraits. And is another example, which is a later portrait of another imperial Yuan emperor. So altogether, we have 8 emperors depicted throughout 23 imperial portraits. And again, he also depicted with his wife Senge, who was an art collector at Yuan court. And with same attitude to portraiture we see in the stone monuments, because they also, during this Mongol imperial period, they are also depicting couples rather than individuals in the steppe. Maurice Rasabi, who was a scholar of Yuan and Mongol imperial history, he highlights this universalism, what he calls universalism in the approach of Kublai Khan. And we will see in this portraiture, just in this particular field of making portraits, the cosmopolitan nature attitude to productions also applies to Kublai Khan when he invites different artists. We saw Anigir, for instance, working for him. We have Central Asian artists working, and as well as Mongolian. Horgosun is one name we have working at his court. So universalism, meaning that that was his intentional approach, not only ruling the empire, but also in the productions he ordered and he commissioned. Based on the scholars, several scholars' research, we can conclude that as of now, we have three names of three individuals who are associated with the production of the Mongol imperial portraits at Yuan court. One is Horgosun, and we have Nepalese artist Anigir's name, and Shangan talks at length about a third Chinese artist named Li Xiaoyang. Isabelle Charlot, in her article, she brought our attention to the stone monuments, which are considered as, in her words, as ongong, which is a word that stands for spirit support, and connects to shamanistic practices among the Mongol communities. Today, these practices still alive. As you see in this slide, the stone monuments, some of them they consider to be still spirit supports, and they are devoted as such. They are paid a major attention by the communities that live in this local area, and they put, as you see, scarves, and they put smear them with milk and with fat, and they put even money bills in this monuments. My approach, so we have this universalist approach of Kublai Khan to production at his court. He consulted with Chinese traditions, with Central Asian, Nepalese, Tibetan traditions, but as well as Mongolian traditions. So what kind of Mongolian perspectives we can then search and investigate in the painted portraits currently at Palace Museum? My research analyzed this within the in connection with the stone monuments, and investigate them aligning them in this very important part of the Mongol tradition of ancestral worship, where there are certain elements extremely important. And we will, as we continue with my presentation, I will be referring to them. Ong would be the spirit, and images and objects with the spirit supports. I'll be referring also to Sult. Ancestral worship aims to connect with what with Suld, or some scholars translate it as vital energy. I refrain from using the word shamanism in my scholarship, following some scholarly debate and controversy and questioning of applicability of this very corrupted word in traditions which are still very live concerning the ancestral worship, such as Mongols, for instance. And so among the Tibetans, a Tibetan scholar, Matthew Kapstein, uses the word spirit mediumship to replace, to refer to a particular aspect of ancestral worship, and the understanding the spirits, the reality, the realm of those beings that are our ancestors, and they connect with us through their spirits. In particular, connection with the images and objects, the notion of golden kinship exists even up to today, but starting from the times of the Mongol imperial period, from 13th century until now, the lineage of Genghis Khan is considered as legitimate power and legitimate authority among the Mongols, and it's known as golden kinship, or in Mongolian it's known as Altanurag. And Mongols were divided into so many tribal communities, and they had possession of different areas and landscapes and environments. In this particular case, we're looking at the tribal lineages connecting the golden kinship, or going back to the imperial lineage of Mongol rulers, and this is still existing lineage known as Borjgin. So then these two portraits belong to this one lineage of golden kinship. And when we see, as art historians, when we see the visual analysis, when we see the visual prominence of these two portraits and specific highlights of this, what the artistic choices were made to show this to Mongol emperors, is that the tension on white. And this is another distinct difference between Mongol portraits of Yuan emperor of Yuan period and the other Chinese emperors of other Han Chinese dynasties, is that the color is uniquely white, not only in the headgear, but also in the robe and the simplicity of the robe as such. There is also, if you see here, the color of red is sort of the face is made into this reddish tone, and the headgear of Kublai Khan is also highlighted with red. Red color is highlighted in the empresses, in the garments of the empresses. The main chubby empress is placed to the right, which is auspicious direction for the Mongols, and it's also the red highlight of this garment is also important. So when we look into this color symbolism in terms of Mongol understanding, white is represented in connection with rulership, in Mongol imperial rulership, and represented in, for instance, in the sites as 8 white gears or 8 white yurts that were erected specifically for the family of the Mongol emperors. And their standards, 9 white sult or 9 white standards that were made with white mare's hair. And red was also important for Mongols, specifically denoting the fire and fertility and hearth. When we look into the Mongol ancestral devotion connecting to Genghis Khan, we see from the Western travelers to Mongolia in 13th century that it's not unique to the Genghis Khan's portraits, but the image of Genghis Khan was worshipped even prior to Yuan court. And these images did not survive. However, we see this passage in Plano Carpini's book, where he talks about the other images that were made in devotion to the emperor. In terms of sites, we also read from different accounts that the sites were erected and organized specifically for ancestral worship. And there is a different understanding of imperial and ancestral portraits, specifically within the Mongol ancestral worship. So there were gears or yurts erected where they contained stone sculptures, and they also had constant incense burning in front of these sculptures. Then we read in Rashid ad-Din's account, not only Rashid ad-Din, but also we read in other accounts, the existence of this particular site in Hinti Mountains, which is a northwestern part of Mongolia, known as Ich Horik in Mongolian, and translated as Great Forbidden Sanctuary. And this was a protected area in mountains where only imperial worship was conducted. And we read from Rashid ad-Din's account from 13th, 14th century that this great forbidden sanctuary contained images where, again, they were part of this ancestral worship and connection, and incense and fire was burnt in front of it nonstop. And this is a protected area where only the lineage, the descendants, successors of this family line, Borgian line, were allowed to enter, and no other people were allowed to enter. Now, we also read that even Yuan emperors were erecting sites for imperial worship, not only in the territories of China, south of Great Wall of China, but also in Mongolia. For instance, there were memorial temple. Rinqing is a Mongolian scholar whose account tells us about 2 temples erected by Yuan emperors in Mongolia. And the site, this is near Borkhan Khaldun mountain, and another Suld temple, which was specifically known as Chinggis Khan's Suld temple. And there is also a valley, entire valley, which is translated as Hurgin Hundi, or can be translated as Valley of Portraits. And these images you see here are all erected in this Valley of Portraits. So in Shangang, a Chinese art historian, he tells us that Chinese emperors always had different sites where the imperial portraits were situated. However, he notes that Yuan emperors diversified the terminology of the sites dedicated to imperial and ancestral portraits, and also created also different sites associated, built different sites associated with imperial and ancestral portraits, in addition to the terminology existing in Chinese tradition. So we have 3 terms and 3 different sites dedicated to generally imperial portraits. Shen Yudian, Hall of Imperial Ancestors, or Mongolian translation of it, Hall of Descending, apologies, so Descending of Spirits. In Tang, Hall of Imperial Portraits, and Tai Miao, Temple of Ancestors. Ethnographer Antoine Mostard, he had a ethnography research in early 20th century among the Mongol communities to understand the notion and concept and the use of imagery. What is the imagery in Mongolian conception? And according to him, a man's representation was regarded to be the man himself. To get hold of a drawing or a photograph of someone would give magic power over him. So making sculptures and making images was to represent a person. And so when Kublai Khan orders his court official, Korgusun, to paint the portraits of his ancestors, his father, his grandfather, Chinggis Khan, and then the second emperor, Wudai Khan, who were long deceased by his time, it is part of the representation replacing the men themselves. And existing of these spaces and structures in Mongolia proper, which was specifically erected to contain these images and for nonstop, long-lasting worship through fire and through burning incense, was contained in Mongolia proper. And Shangang tells us that these portraits were also placed in portable yurts that were erected even in China when they became rulers of China as well during Yuan period, and also palaces which were built now as immobile, sedentary structures. Even there, these portraits were made for and then distributed. And this Shenyudian is a very interesting site because it's translated, especially I took this translation from the dictionary where it's translated hall for spiritual sentu. So what I say about standards is this particular poles that I erected in this around this chieftains' homes or rulers' homes, portable yurts, as you see in this photograph that was taken in early 20th century. Again, I'm talking about the tradition which are still very much alive and are maintained. And so the white collar of this standards is made with white mares, white horses' hair. And within this standards, they are considered as spirit supports. And they're mediators between the living and between their ancestors. And ethnographer, anthropologists such as Dulam tells us that in the past and in the present, there was a tradition developed among the Mongols to create different effigies in different anthropomorphic form and then put them into this top part of the standards as innermost ancestral connection, or also connecting to the Sud or the imperial essence, the vital energy. The notion of vital energy is not unique to Mongolia. It exists in other cultures as well. In China, the parallel analogous to Sud would be Qi, and in Tibet, analogous to Sud would be La. Again, this is the essence, the substance that innermost importance that were placed, according to Dulam, into these standards and worshipped as the ancestral connection. So within all this, we can come to the conclusion that these two images belong to this larger understanding of ancestral worship, where distinction is made between imperial portraiture and ancestral worship, one, and two is that these images that are made in landscape and have a public access to this as of now, we don't have textual records to further our understanding what particular people they depict. However, they are devoted as local people even today as part of this ongoing spirit supports. And so I'm adding, my work contributes to the scholarly analysis by saying that this portraits, even though it's made by ink and colors on silk, and continues the imperial tradition of portraiture in China, it also continues, and it is mostly part of the ancestral tradition in Mongolian perspectives. And for Mongolian perspectives, it is more than ancestral connection, but it is also connection to the innermost part or the Sud or vital energy of the emperor. And the Sud, again, the translation, there is no one consensus of what translation should go with Sud, but this vital energy is one word. Another word is magic power. Tatiana Skrenikova, a Mongolist, she translates this word as a charisma. So the charisma of the emperor has to be maintained through this worshiping of this particular image. And if you see this, the images, they are different in terms of the painted images, very meticulous in giving the visage, giving the particular details of the emperor. Korgasun himself never met with emperor, but he knew emperor from the memory, just like many Mongols did and they do. And so his great grandfather served served Genghis Khan, and his memory served as the kind of the record to depicting the details as you see in the portraiture right here. And also basing the portraiture within the imperial ancestral tradition is when we look at what happened after the Yuan emperor and what happened with the Mongols after the Yuan dynasty. And so we have portraits made of other rulers in later period in Mongolia, such as, for instance, Danabazar, who was a 17th century ruler, a close friend of Qin Kanxi emperor. And this portrait dates around 1830, and he is known as 37th descendant of Genghis Khan, and he is a legitimate ruler, part of Borjigin and often golden kinship. And so we see this in this portrait, which is made within Tibetan tradition, as you see here, on cotton. He is depicted with a particular image right above his head. When we look about this concept of placing an image right above his head,
my interruption.
Two lines in Plana Carpini. One, and when he talks about a tent carried about the emperor, and another one, and we see in the Tibetan portraiture, there is no a tent like this. It's only in Zanabazar's portraiture we see a tent erected right on top, or the image in the shape of a tent, of a structure, and in the tent we see the effigy, or we see the image. So in other words, again, this further connects us to the understanding of the portrait, quote unquote portrait, as a spirit support, and then objects of Sud, or specifically the innermost ancestral connection. And if you further want to learn more details about this research, this article is coming out this fall in this volume. And so thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Orna. Well, that was quite a series of extraordinary papers on extraordinary things. And there have been a few questions. One is a question to which I'd like to also append something. And this is to Adrian Diese. And it comes from Michael Brose, who's faculty at Indiana University. I was struck by the similarity of the short, long lines in the Yoruba divination text to the hexagrams in early Chinese Yijing divination texts. Is there any relationship?
I think that's an interesting question. I think your perspective may be more informed than mine on the relational aspect.
Okay. Yeah, I can't speak to any direct relationship between these two different divination systems, other than they both use binary coding, which is then transferred to either paper or, in the case of Ifa, often to a resin, which is itself empowered in the application, in that writing process. I do want to mention something, Adrian, about the cover of Lijadu's text, which had an image of a divination tray, or what's called an opon ifa. And I don't know if we have that image available, if we're able to go back in this complicated maelstrom of technology. But anyway, significantly, or perhaps not significantly, the tray is set on its side. Normally the faces would appear at top and bottom. And that is in alignment with Eshu Elegbara, who is, there we are. Right, the faces are associated with Eshu, who's a trickster, a message bearer, the Lord of the Crossroads, in being set vertically, right? There would be an alignment between the diviner and the supplicant. Eshu was translated by many Christian missionaries in this period as Satan, as the devil, as you know. And so it strikes me here as at least slightly compelling that this demonic figure, if you want, is set off to the side, set off kilter. And as an image, there's certainly a power to that. But something to consider. Okay, just give me a moment here. Another question comes. This one is for Brendan McMahon. It comes from Victoria Langland, Associate Professor of History and Portuguese at the University of Michigan. First off, Victoria says, thank you for this really fascinating and visually beautiful presentation. I wanted to know more about the context in which descriptions of birds appear in the Florentine Codex. When and why do these descriptions appear? Is there any explicit reference to them as being symbols of mutability? On a similar note, are there entries about feathered objects and the importance of using feathers, or feathers from particular birds, in creating these divinational materials? In short, I'm very persuaded by your assertion that the descriptions of birds' iridescent hues correlate well with Aztec cosmologies that stress mutability. But I wondered if they were also deliberately and explicitly making that connection themselves in their writing.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for this question. So the Florentine Codex is endlessly engaging as an object to think with, because it not only contains a lot of fascinating information, but allows us to track the kind of push-pull of this late 16th century environment, as you probably know. So this a book that I mentioned, book 11, really sort of maps onto a European idea about what a cultural encyclopedia should have, which is a sort of section on the natural world. The other kind of major places where feathers are discussed, there of course appear in visual form throughout the manuscript, as they form such an integral part of the material culture. But book 9 and 10 respectively, on kind of merchants and people, there's a long section on featherworking techniques that address feathers in really sophisticated ways, and perhaps reveal other kind of lexical patterns which will help us differentiate between different types of feathers that people like Alison Kaplan at University of Santa Barbara are working on. But in terms of texts that reference the kind of ephemerality of these materials, the big one that comes to mind most immediately are some of these flower songs or poems that come down to us from Netzahualcoyotl, who's a 15th century ruler of the kind of lakeside city of Texcoco. And he very explicitly uses the quetzal feather as a metaphor for the kind of transience of life, the quetzal feather torn asunder. And I think it's traditionally interpreted because as a sort of sign of fragility. These are fragile materials. But the other thing that we learned from the Codex is that the way in which they produce color is structural. So the slightest touch will collapse these delicate structures and will extinguish them. So that metaphor of fragility, physical damage, I think speaks also to the way that they produce color. So there's a really interesting way in which iridescence plays out in this realm of kind of metaphors of ephemerality too. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. We don't have any more time. We have all but a minute. I do have one final question for Brendan. So to just have this correctly, see if I do, a certain green, for example, might be given its name by virtue of it not having been that green a moment beforehand. Is that the nature of its greenness is precisely that it was not that just minutes before?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think those kind of lists of colors that we see, and even the inceptive suffix to some extent, just speak to the way in which Nahuatl is such a richly metaphoric language, right? So green as a kind of abstract notion doesn't really exist, right? It's embedded into this material landscape. So it's grass, it's flowers, it's jade, it's feathers. So there's a really, it's sort of a great reminder about kind of things that we seem to think are immaterial are in fact really embedded into these substrates of materiality.
And always relational. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of the panelists today. These were extraordinary and edifying talks. I'm honored to have been a moderator and to have had front row seats. But then again, these days, don't we all? Thanks so much. And thank you to everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of this conference.